Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 4 of the 2025 First Stand International Tournament. We are in the back half of the group stage here. We are getting closer and closer to finding out which 4 of these 5 teams will be staying alive, will be qualifying for the semifinals, the bracket stage of this tournament, and which team will be the first one that is officially eliminated. By the end of today, we're going to have a pretty clear picture. Depending on the results, we might even have an answer by the end of today. Of course, obviously there's still a lot up in the air, still a lot to play for all of these teams, and we're going to be going over all of that at the end of the video. But if you want to know my thoughts on what has happened so far at this tournament, the first 3 days, what I expected coming into the tournament, and whether or not it's lived up to those expectations, check out the playlist up on the iCard. That's every single video that we've done on First Stand up there. But today, of course, we're going to be going over the 2 best of 3s on day number 4, getting closer and closer to finding out who will make that best of 5 stage. So if you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Did things go as you expected today, or were you surprised by the outcomes? Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback there. But let's go ahead and jump into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of these series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of both series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said earlier, we are going to be talking about the standings at the end of today's video. There are so many circumstances that we could end up having in terms of tiebreakers because of the way the tiebreaker system works at this tournament. So we'll be covering all of that at the end of the video, but most of today will be spent talking about the 2 best of 3s that happened on day 4. So without further ado, let's get into the content. Our first series of the day, our first series of day number 4 is a pretty important one in terms of qualification. Quite frankly, it could be one of the more important ones for the rest of the tournament because it could seal one team's place in the upper echelons, potentially as a top 2 seed. It's a matchup between the representative from the LTA in Team Liquid and the representative from the LCP in CTBC Flying Oyster. Obviously, this is a pretty important matchup for both of them because this is supposed to be a winnable series for both of them when you're talking about kind of the bottom 3 teams playing off against each other. Those are the games that those teams kind of have to win. And so far, CFO have kind of done their job, at least in terms of like what they have been at this tournament so far. They've been able to take down Corp, which is what they were supposed to do. And they also ended up losing pretty heavily to Hanwha Life Esports, which is also what they were expected to do. If you're going to be a team that ends up making the bracket stage, they have done what, you got to do to get there. They are on pace to do that at this point. But so are Team Liquid, at the very least, going into a series like this. Now, things could get really locked in for them if they do end up walking out of this series with a win, because 2 wins definitely looks like the amount that you're going to need in order to make the next stage, in order to feel good about being in the next stage, obviously depending on what happens later on in the day. But if Team Liquid can pick up that second win, especially with both of them being over, Corp and CFO, that's ginormous for TL. They don't exactly have an easy road tomorrow. They have to play Hanwha Life as their final series, and so it's kind of important that they pick up a win here today to guarantee their spot. Obviously, if that doesn't end up happening, things can get a little bit murky for them, but that's the case for CFO on the other side of this as well. Both of these teams kind of need to win this series in order to feel as safe as possible going into that final day, where they both face incredibly tough competition in HLE and Top Esports respectively. So how do they match up against each other in particular? Well, honestly, I think Team Liquid matches up very well into CFO, at least on paper. When you're talking about the big strength of Team Liquid, it's obviously the bot lane. They have been not only exceptional this year, they were exceptional last year, and I think they've gotten even better. I've called Jan the best player in the West. I continue to die on that hill. I do think he is the best player across both North America and Europe at the current moment, at least in terms of consistent production. And the problem for CFO in that regard is they really rely on Doggo and Kaiwing winning early on in the 2v2 in order to generate as much pressure as they want. If that's not going to be the case, which I have a hard time believing that Doggo and Kaiwing are going to be better than Jan and Core JJ in like a neutral bot lane matchup, like if you're not able to play through bot lane for CFO, all of a sudden a lot of your early game plans do kind of go out the window. It's a lot more difficult to end up playing out the rest of these games if your main source of pressure that you typically have relied upon is just no longer there. So I definitely think that's a point in favor of Team Liquid. And then when you're also looking at like the weaknesses, quote unquote, for Team Liquid, typically you're looking at like Impact's been a bit of a weakness at this tournament. I'm just not sure CFO have the type of players that are going to be able to take advantage of that. Junjia is a late game team fighter. His early games have been good at this tournament, but they've not always been exceptional. He's not always the biggest international performer. And quite frankly, Umt's playstyle is the exact kind of player that gives Junjia the most amount amount of problems, these super flippy, very aggressive, mechanically talented, but sometimes stupid with decisions junglers. That's always been the type of player that Junjie has struggled the most to go into because his mechanics just aren't elite in the early game. He's not the best skirmisher. And so it ends up in these situations where enemy junglers can get leads. Hongq is a good mid laner, but again, much more of a late game carry, somebody who doesn't necessarily dominate the 1v1, and all APA needs to do is survive the early game in order to be relevant. Rest and Driver have not looked phenomenal at this tournament. Rest has definitely looked better than Driver, but I don't think Impact should be punishable in the same way that he was against some of the other teams. Like, I just think this is a good matchup for Team Liquid. For CFO, you just have to play your game and hope that you have enough talent to be able to come out on top in that regard. If Junjie is a better jungler than Umti, if Umti just has like an absolutely horrible day, which is obviously possible, we've seen so many of those from him, then I think that that's kind of the direction that CFO needs to go in order to win. And obviously Doggo and Kaiwing, if they can actually win the 2v2, come out on top against Yeon and Corp, like that completely changes the entire complexion of the series. But both of those things I'm not necessarily expecting to happen from a matchup perspective. This is not only a good matchup for Team Liquid, but they already should be the better and more talented of these two teams. So I'm definitely expecting Team Liquid to be able to walk out of here with a win, but it is worth noting, at least this is something that we kind of found out on broadcast before this series started, Spawn is not here. He had to leave for some sort of personal emergency. It's not public what it is. I'm not going to try to speculate on what it is, obviously, but Spawn is a huge part of what this team does as their head coach, not only because their drafts are really good, but because of his motivation. And we've seen what's happened with Team Liquid when he's not there. He wasn't there for them at the beginning of the year before the cross-conference tournament, and they barely made the cross-conference tournament. The moment he got there for Team Liquid, they got better, and they started leveling up again. You hope that that's not going to be an issue in this series, but it certainly is something to point out. So those are the things to kind of keep track of. But of course, the only way to know how this series ends up going is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was CFO. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and all of the things that I just talked about for Team Liquid, having a really nice matchup, having a pretty decent advantage, all of that goes out the window now, dropping game number 1. As you guys know, game number 1 is definitely the most important game in a best of 3, because winning both of the final 2 games is a lot more difficult than only having to win one of the final 2 games. And obviously, coming off of a loss, it means you're going to lose a bit of momentum, and in that same vein, you lose side selection for game number 3, even if you are able to take that game number 2. So many things kind of going against the team that ends up losing in game number 1, and that is the problem that Team Liquid is now going to run into. The frustrating part is, honestly, there is no excuse in this game number 1. I think they outdrafted CFO. I certainly think their draft is more cohesive. I think CFO fell into a ton of traps that really put them into some bad matchups and some bad positions in my eyes. I don't think they have the scaling, and I think that there are multiple matchups that won't necessarily have the pressure that they're looking for in the early game. If you're playing against a team that has more lane control and scales better, typically you're going to favor them, especially when you already expected that team to win. But somehow, some way, CFO just end up executing on their own draft a little bit better, their comfort picks a little bit better, and they walk out of here with a victory. Let's go ahead and talk about draft as we do with the start of these segments. The reason I think TL has a better draft is because, like I said, I think you're looking at better scaling with things like Gwen and Kai'Sa in the back half of the game. They're just going to have a more direct way to win the game. Like, Azir is a problem, but I don't think they have a secondary carry here, and they don't really have as much setup as maybe you would like for the Azir. You're hoping and praying that, like, Alistar and K'Sante can be that, but K'Sante's not the most efficient, like, secondary engaged threat. Like, I guess Xin Zhao could theoretically be that, but, like, I don't think you have a phenomenal late game comp here if you're CFO. And with Vi, Rakan, like Talia wall, Gwen flank, Kai'Sa ultimate, there's so many ways for Team Liquid to be able to play fights in the back half of this game. And I think with that Talia on B1, APA is already very good at the champion. You would expect them to be able to control the pacing of the entire mid game. Vi Talia is very difficult to deal with. And not only that, but CFO commit what I consider to be an actual crime, which is drafting Azir into Talia. I think the fact that they ended up doing that, and that they had not only won the game, but that the Azir was effective, like, that is the most disappointing thing for Team Liquid for me in this entire game. Is just, if you pick Azir into Talia, you deserve to lose 1,000 games in a row. Like, I truly believe that there's no way that you should be able to play out this matchup. This is the most obvious counter pick in favor of Talia in the entire universe, and you still kind of let it happen. Now, I think Doggo had a good game. I think Junjie obviously had a good game. Rest was solid on the top side. We continue to see Impact struggle on champions that need to have pressure in the early game to do anything, but at the end of the day, if this Talia is not going to get out on the map, and if this Vi is just going to be absolutely atrocious, like, all of that pressure that you're supposed to be able to generate in the early game now goes over to Xin Zhao, and he does a lot with it. And if he can get his carries fed, like, that's a way to win, and that's exactly what happened here. So we'll talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Hongq on the Azir. Again, I really want to criticize him. I don't want to give him player of the game because I think it's greedy and I think it's disrespectful to go into a team at this tournament and pick Azir into Taliyah. Again, maybe I'm just way lower on the matchup than everybody else, but as somebody who's played this matchup 100,000 times, like I just don't get it. Like I don't get why you would ever opt into this. I think that there are better picks in almost every capacity. I get that Hanwha probably plays a lot of Azir, but this is just like full greed and somehow, some way it's rewarded in this game, which is definitely frustrating. But yeah, Hanwha was the best player on the Rift. He completely outplayed both Umti and APA in terms of being able to generate pressure in the mid game, specifically APA, who just had a horrible game on the Taliyah. We'll talk about it as we go further along. I mean, Junji obviously helped out a lot, but once Hanwha got rolling, once he was able to start taking over these fights, he was most damage in the game by far. Clearly, he's very practiced on the champion. Clearly, he likes it a lot, and that's why he opted into the matchup. He didn't care who he was going into. He was always going to pick Azir if Azir was up, and that's gotta be like the explanation. I want this to be punished more. I hate this matchup for Azir so much, and, you know, to see him walk out of here 4-0-3 player of the game after opting into this, like, choosing to pick Azir into Taliyah, it's frustrating to me, but Junji is a big reason why this early game was so seamless. His early games have been pretty good at this tournament, man. That was not what I got out of the tape in the LCP when I was watching the Flying Oysters. It was not really like, oh, Junji runs these early games, and they're able to kind of translate that into some really nice, consistent late games. It was more so, like, Doggo and Kaiwing are up like 500 gold on their own, 20 CS on their own without any jungle intervention, and Junji and Hanwha are really good team fighters, and that's why they're consistently able to win around 20-25 minutes at Otacon, at Baron, all of that stuff. They were just very consistent at winning those kinds of games. That's not really been who they are at this tournament. Junji is picking Xin Zhao, and he's running the early game, quite frankly, just being more active. It's good stuff. Rest has also really impressed me at this tournament, kind of the opposite of what I expected there. Driver, to me, was way better domestically. Maybe that's because he was coming in later on in Fearless series, and the top laners that he was playing into had lost more picks, but here in the best of threes, like, Rest has been awesome, but one of the better top laners at this tournament, certainly better than Impact in terms of the consistency that he's had. Doggo and Kaiwing were fine. Yan was awesome for Team Liquid, like, genuinely maybe, like, best player in the game type of awesome, so I can't like, praise Doggo and Kaiwing too much when I don't even think they were the better bot lane in this game, but at the end of the day, they didn't make any bad moves. Like, they were fine on the side of CFO. It's just the middle of the map and top side to a lesser extent were just so dominant, but really it was Junji and Hanwha that really kind of brought this game home for CFO. And then for Liquid on the other side, Umti and APA just getting absolutely brutalized. It wasn't just them. Impact had a really bad game on the Gwen as well, but really, this is Umti and APA having a stereotypically bad performance. This is worst case scenario for the middle of the map for Team Liquid. Umti is going to get done of the game. When he loses, man, he just looks unplayable. Like, there's like nothing else to say. When he is not in a good position in a game by 15 minutes, he looks like the worst jungler in the entire universe. It is absurd. Like, this Vi game was awful. He's a clear choice for dead of the game, but I don't want to let APA off the hook either. I think this is easily his worst game of the tournament up until this point. Like, maybe his worst game of the year. This was a really bad Taliyah game. You get gifted with this perfect matchup. You have a jungler that's going to have a ton of prio and pressure to be able to fight for these skirmishes. You yourself are playing a mid laner that not only has a really good laning phase against Azir that can shove the wave pretty effortlessly, but can roam way more consistently than a champion like Azir can, so you should be able to beat him and be able to get out on the map. Like, that's the reason Azir is so bad in this matchup, is because Taliyah kind of wins everywhere in the early game. So not only do you have all of that, but you also have an AD carry who's like popping off in a lot of these fights, like a support who's playing fine, and you still end up running it throughout a lot of these fights. It's absurd. Like, there's no excuse for losing a lot of the skirmishes or giving over a lot of these dragons or losing at Otacon in the way that they did. Like, there's just no excuse. There was no way to get away with that kind of gameplay. Umti and APA were awful in this game. Like, very reminiscent, I want to say, of Yike and Vladi at the beginning of this tournament. Like, it was that kind of bad performance. Maybe a little bit better. It wasn't quite as atrocious as those games were, but like, it was pretty darn close because Yan was doing a lot for this team. Again, he might have been the best player in this game. In fact, I will kind of say, like, from a mechanics perspective, he was the best player in this game. It just didn't matter. I thought Core was fine. Impact cannot play carries, man. Like, this dude is just not good at these kinds of champions, and every single time he opts in to these matchups, he kind of gets destroyed. That's been happening domestically, and it's certainly happening internationally right now. I'm not going to continue to reiterate the year 2 theory that I have, but like, here you go. It's another game of Impact losing a game that he absolutely should not lose. And, if I'm Team APA are going to run it, that's not winnable for Team Liquid, regardless of what the draft is. So they got the perfect draft that they wanted. They still dropped game number 1. You got to lock in. You got to win both of these games in a row, because honestly, losing this game number 1 or losing the series in general, it kind of puts you in a little bit of trouble, because you're looking at one win going into a matchup with Hanwha Life tomorrow. And then all of a sudden, one series ends up flipping. Top Esports drop one more series than maybe is expected. You're in a tiebreaker and you could be out of this tournament first if you're Team Liquid. Like, you have to be able to pick up a win, not only here in game 2, but throughout this series. But for CFO, if they pick up a win here, they're guaranteed. They're locked into the top 4. They might even be kind of guaranteed to be a top 2 seed, depending on how things end up going. Really excited to see what happens for CFO, but of course, the only way to know is to go into game number 2. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was CFO. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to take this series 2-0, and disaster has struck for Team Liquid. This is worst case scenario, at least in terms of the spot that they are already in. For them, obviously, things could be worse. They're still not the favorites to be eliminated, but they've just put themselves in a position where it's kind of out of their control at this point, unless they pull off a miracle tomorrow against Hanwha Life Esports. This is really not a great spot for TL to be in, and it's all their fault, like entirely their fault in this game. This draft is way worse than game number 1. It's way worse than anything we've seen from them at this tournament. I'm not sure if this is because Spawn is gone. I don't want to try and speculate. Maybe this was always the plan for this draft, or a kind of draft like this in game number 2, but oh boy, we're going to get into it when we talk about it. But for CFO, what a win. What a really great draft from them. I think they had some really, really interesting decisions here that they ended up making. I really like the way that they ended up drafting towards the back half of this draft, and I think generally it set them up for a lot of success. But at the end of the day, they ended up outplaying Team Liquid. They were better. They had better players on their team, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about that. So let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? Let's talk about that draft, why I do think this is super CFO favored. First of all, we got to touch upon the elephant in the room. You drafted Corky Ziggs and put him on the wrong players. Like, there's nothing else to say here. Like, it either was a mistake or they just overthought the problem so much that it ended up, like, really costing them the game. You took the best player in the West, the best player on your team, the player that had really popped off in game number 1 that tried to 1v9 and salvage it for you, and you put him on Ziggs in game number 2. Not only that, but you have the best Ziggs player, or at least the most accomplished Ziggs player, maybe in the world at the current moment, in the mid lane here, and you put him on Corky, a champion that I have been complaining about nonstop in the mid lane. I think he is really strong in the bot lane. I think someone like Jan could do a lot of really good things with Corky, but you take APA off of Ziggs, you put him on a champion that has no mid-game priority, absolutely no way to skirmish at all, will not have any pressure at all into Yone, will just straight up lose that matchup without any intervention, and then you take your best player and you put him on a pick that he can't really take over on, that he can't pop off on. Like, if Ziggs ends up winning this game for you, it's because the rest of the team had really good macro. It's not going to be up to Jan anymore. He can't mechanically outplay things on Corky, or on Ziggs, I should say. It's ridiculous to see that they put these these champions in this position, not only because these players are so obviously better at the other champions, but because I think it's worse matchup-wise. Like, I think Corky is worse into Yone than Ziggs is. Like, I actively think you hurt your own team by making these decisions. It just made no sense to me. Like, this is one of those, we've thought the problem through 800 times and ended up overthinking it and coming to the wrong conclusion because we thought about it too much. There is no justification for playing these champions in this order, but also, there's really not a lot of justification for drafting this in the first place. I'm very critical of the Jax on B4. This feels like one of those champs that you draft not only because Impact has a skin on him, but also because, oh, we have Sejuani, and we kind of need to take advantage of Sejuani somehow. Maybe we were looking at something else in the top lane, but we don't really have a lot of options. We might as well pick Jax, right? It's something that takes advantage of Sejuani in the jungle, and Impact is just not very good at this champion. And then you look at CFO, and their draft strategy is awesome. It's really smart. You see the Corky on B1, you kind of expect that to go to Jan, or at least you expect that to be something that is, flexed between the 2 lanes, and so you pick the Maokai, something that's going to be super consistent and is a takeaway from Umpty. It's been his most successful champion, and then you take the Tristana, which is a takeaway from APA, one of his more consistent champions. Clearly, Doggo has been able to play into it, and Tristana beats Corky, like, really hard. If they do end up sending it into the bot lane now, all of a sudden, you have an AD carry that is a takeaway from their mid laner if they want to put Corky bot, and beats Corky bot if they do end up wanting to go in that direction. It's a really smart move. Add on to that the fact that you end up taking Gangplank on R5, which I really like in this draft because Team Liquid's one and only out here is like a Jax split push, potentially like dominating, like Jax, Sedge, Corki just being too big of a problem to be able to deal with. Ziggs taking a ton of towers and, you know, really dealing with that, and Poppy kind of neutralizing the Tristana or the Leona or the Yone engage because the Poppy's really strong here. But you know who obliterates Poppy? Gangplank. That is a really, really nice draft here for CFO. I think it's one of the more consistent ones we've seen throughout this entire tournament, and they took full advantage of it. And so I just feel really good about this for CFO. This was such a smart draft from them, and Team Liquid obviously drafted poorly, but I really want to give a lot of praise to CFO because I think against almost any draft, this is like a brilliant process for CFO. Again, one of the better drafts we've seen at the entire tournament. Doggo's going to get player of the game for me here in game number 2. How do you not give it to the Tristana? So many resources put into trying to shut down Doggo on Trist, and it just didn't work. He outplayed it every single time. He was clearly very comfortable on this champion, and for this kind of being a pseudo takeaway and for him to be as good as he was on it, it's just really, really great stuff. Doggo has really impressed me at this tournament. He's playing better right now than he did in the LPL. Maybe it's because he's around familiar faces, you know, around region mates here on CFO rather than having to play, you know, in China with, you know, LFL player or LPL players, I should say. It's one of those things that you just never know where a player's comfort level is at, but at the end of the day, he's playing better right now than he did in the LPL, and that is a really good sign. But player of the series for me is going to go to Hongq in the mid lane. Not only was the Azir game awesome in game number 1, but I think this Yone game was really good as well. Yone has a great matchup into Corki. Not only does he beat him in lane because Corki has no way to trade with him, but obviously he's going to have way more pressure in terms of the skirmishes that exist, and that basically neutralizes the Sejuani as well in terms of what she wants to do in the early and in the mid game. All of that added up as well. Like, CFO probably outscale, if only because you're playing around like Maokai Gangplank. Like, there's basically no way for you to be able to win a team fight if you're Team Liquid. Like, again, your best case scenario out here is that you survive the early game. Ziggs is able to get some towers, and then you just play around like Jax, Ziggs, Corki, split pushing throughout the entire game and hoping that you can kind of split the map enough and you get a big enough gold lead to win one fight. Like, CFO is always going to win neutral fights in this game because of their setup, and I think a lot of that is also kind of on their draft, and so I want to give them credit in that regard. But Hongq was really good here. Junjie had a really good series, just completely out-jungled Empty, who was not on his A game today. Driver looked much, much better. This is the best series that he has played so far. Of the 3 series that they have played, this was easily my favorite of Driver's, where he has struggled a bit, but, I guess game, right? Like, he's played 3 games because they've gone 2 games in all of their series, but the Gangplank definitely looked the best. This was a really smart draft pick on R5. It really kind of solidified their ideas, and then Kaiwing was good as well. I don't want to downplay him. He was a big part of why Doggo was able to take over in the way that he was, so big credit to CFO. They were awesome in this series. They were awesome in this game number 2, and this is the kind of game 2 that gives me confidence that this team could not only like beat, you know, Team Liquid and K-Corp regularly and might be better than them on like a whole level package, even if their individual players might be a little bit ranked below them, but this is the kind of game that gives me confidence that they could actually go toe-to-toe with a team like Top Esports tomorrow and do something maybe a little bit crazy. So I'm excited to see that. But for TL on the other side, like, worst case scenario, you put Impact on Jax, which he always loses on. APA is playing Corki with no pressure into a losing lane, and you do that to take him off of his best champion, who you put on your hyper carry, who can't actually do anything this game because the Ziggs can't take over in a losing matchup. Like, worst case scenario, I don't know who was making these decisions, but whoever made them, like, truly send them to the dungeon. Like, I can't even possibly fathom this draft coming from, like, a realistic team that's trying to win the game. This is win trading in terms of the draft that they put out there. All of that on top of the fact that, like, Umti was running it on Sejuani. It's not like he was playing fine this game. He was actively running it. Impact had gold, but he was playing so bad on Jax that he's still gonna get my dud of the game because this guy cannot play Jax. He cannot play carries. He's not been good at all in 2025. I'm getting really fed up with Impact because it's really not been a good look for him so far. He's actively been detrimental to Team Liquid overall. APA got obliterated in the mid lane matchup, not only in a great matchup in game number 1, but opting in to a worse matchup in game number 2 and still losing that. What is Yon gonna do on Ziggs? Like, he's not very good at mages. He's never been good at mages. Even going back to his time in Academy, that was always kind of the big critique of him. Core JJ is playing Poppy, but like, Poppy can't stop a lot of the takeover this game. Yeah, like, she can shut down the jump from Tristana or like potential, you know, Leona going in or whatever, right? But like, what's Core going to do on his own? Absolutely nothing. This is just despicable, quite frankly, from Team Liquid. This is disgusting. And quite frankly, this is maybe the worst that we've ever seen this team look. I don't know what Spawn's issue is, but I hope he gets it resolved because this team looks like nothing without him. And for CFO, this is a fantastic win. As for the outlooks of both of these teams, TL is in trouble, and CFO now has officially qualified for the top 4. They are guaranteed to be a top 4 team with 2 series wins. Congratulations to them. I think a lot of people expected them to be the first team out at this tournament. They could be a top 2 seed. They could have side selection for a semifinals matchup, you know, going into this best of 5 stage. And honestly, they have way over exceeded my expectations. I'm really excited to see what they do from here on out, and it might not even stop in the group stage. They have a big matchup tomorrow that I wouldn't put it past them to win at this point. But then moving on now to our second series of the day, and this one is just as important as the first in terms of how these teams are going to fare moving into the final day and whether or not things are going to be out of control for some teams versus others. It's a matchup between the representative from the LEC in K-Corp and the representative from the LCK in Hanwha Life Esports. Obviously, on paper, this is a pretty difficult one to project positively for K-Corp. They really need to pick up a win here in order to feel comfortable at all going into the final day, because this is their last series. They have yet to have a day off. They played all 4 of the first days. Their day off is day number 5. And so if they end up losing here in this series, they end up going 1-3 in the group stage. And that's a really unfortunate place to be, considering that you don't have the tiebreaker against Team Liquid if they are the other team that does end up at 1-3. So kind of a must-win series here for K-Corp if they want to control their own destiny. This is really their last opportunity to do so, but Hanwha Life Esports, they're not really worried too much. They are 2-0, they are 4-0 in terms of games. They've looked basically unstoppable so far at this tournament. They've absolutely obliterated every team that they've needed to beat. They, destroyed Top Esports on day 1. They destroyed CFO on day number 3, and now we're kind of expecting them to do the same now to K-Corp. It's really hard not to after how dominant they've been, especially after the Top Esports series. There really has not been a team that we could expect to be able to take any games off of HLE. They look like the best team in the world by a pretty large margin right now, and certainly the best team at this tournament. Really, whether you want to consider the LCK like the actual international tournament is kind of up to you, because those teams are just ridiculous, but Hanwha Life is certainly looking like the big favorites to win, and if they play up to their own standard, like, this should not be a particularly close series. Now, we did see HLE troll a bit in day number 3 against CFO. They ended up drafting a ridiculous comp. Obviously the Zed ended up standing out, but playing Nidalee with no early game prio, playing Vladimir top, like, these are crazy things that HLE would only ever play if they really genuinely felt like they were the best team by such a large margin. And honestly, if they continue to troll like that, K-Corp is a talented enough team to be able to take advantage of that in one way or another. I just really doubt that over the course of an entire series, we're going to be seeing K-Corp generate those kinds of advantages and those kinds of leads. I think the problem for KC is not, oh, we need to win a game. It's, oh, we have to win this series, because if we drop to 1-3, if we're sitting in a spot where we only hold a tiebreaker victory over Top Esports, and we're hoping and praying that that ends up, going our way on day number 5. Like, that's a really bad place to be. Winning this basically guarantees them a spot in the group stage, or, in the bracket stage, and that is obviously fantastic, but this is the toughest challenge they have yet to face, and they have already faltered at weaker challenges. So, obviously a must-win for K-Corp, not a must-win for HLE. They don't need to do anything, basically, from this point onwards. Maybe they want to try and go for an undefeated tournament. I think that would obviously be something that they are interested in, but that's really the only thing they have left to achieve. They're already in the bracket stage, and they're probably going to be the number 1 seed, obviously, games depending, but I'm not looking for HLE to be a team that comes out here and stomps or to change my opinion on them. This is all up to K-Corp. Can they pull off the upset against a team that doesn't really have a lot to play for in this series? That is the question, but the only way to know how this goes is to go game by game, and that means starting with game 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and we kind of expected this. Again, nobody should be surprised that HLE is walking out of here with a game 1 win, even though it's on red side. I think both of these drafts are interesting for different reasons. I don't hate K-Corp's draft. I really like the idea of just hoping and praying that you are able to gain pressure and priority. I tried to say both of them at the same time, but pressure and priority in the early part of this game. People know I love Talia. I'm very vocal about that. I think Rumble is incredibly strong, certainly worth a B1 right now. Xin Zhao is definitely going to be able to create some pressure and, typically be able to skirmish something like Vi on the other side of this matchup, and you're kind of relying on the fact that you've got a bunch of winning lanes. I think Ezreal is really good into Varus. This is going to be kind of the standard answer to Varus in a lot of cases. The problem is that you're kind of relying on your ability to win early, even in good matchups, and sometimes that's really difficult to do against the best teams in the world, and that's exactly what we saw here. The one bad matchup for K-Corp in this one is probably top lane. Like, Rumble is your late game out, and a really strong champion just in general that can kind of overcome some bad matchups, but Aurora is in such an amazing spot to be able to take over this game. This entire draft is kind of built around the Aurora. They end up flexing it into the top lane, taking the Sylas on R5 to try to get her out of the Talia matchup because they want her in a lane that she actually can dominate, and Aurora absolutely punishes the Rumble early, and We definitely saw that. Zeus was a monster, but he's not even player of the game, because as much as the comp is centered around the Aurora, and as much as I do think Zeus was the most, like, relevant player, I should say, in the game, like, Aurora was the most relevant champion, I think the best played game absolutely goes to Zeka, and he's going to get my player of the game here. Again, kind of talking about how this draft ends up operating, you do have scaling on the side of HLE, but almost all of it is centered around the fact that Aurora needs to stabilize in the mid game because you're not really able to contest a lot of these objectives, and Silas needs to get really fed, and he needs to be able to fight really consistently, and that's exactly what Zeka did here. This guy's obviously world-class, like top 5 player in the world, A+, whatever you want to call him, type of player. He is unreal when he's playing at his absolute best, and Vladi has really struggled at this tournament, and so to see a matchup that, you know, Zeka opted out of a better matchup with the Aurora into the Talia to take the Silas into the mid lane, which again is a worse matchup because Zeus needed that better matchup on the top side. You wanted to be able to exploit that top lane matchup a bit more, and even then, like, Zeka's like, I'll take the worst matchup. I'm gonna win anyways. I'm the better of these two mid laners, and that's exactly what he did. He took the worst matchup, he took the Silas, and he still ended up being super relevant. That's why he's my player of the game. Genuinely electric stuff here from Zeka. And honestly, he was just way better than Vladi. There's not even really a lot to talk about. But Zeus was excellent on the Aurora. I think, again, you kind of build this entire draft around getting Aurora into a good spot, and I think that is kind of what HLE wanted to do here. I do think that their engage is fine. Like, you don't have, like, consistent options in the same way that K-Corp have in the back half of the game, because Leona and Xin Zhao and, you know, Talia Wall, like Rumble Ultimate, you have so many different ways to play 5v5s for K-Corp, even if they don't have a ton of damage. Like, Talia Ezreal's just not a very high damage carry duo. That's what gives me concern. HLE probably have more damage in the late game. In fact, they definitely have more damage in the late game, but their setups are going to be a bit more difficult. You have to rely on Zeus having a really good game in order to be in a position where you can create a lot more efficiently. And he did. He had a really great game. Peanut was pretty solid here on the Vi. I thought Viper was really good on the Varus, almost underratedly good on the Varus. Delight was pretty solid on the Poppy as well. Overall, you're just looking at a pretty positive game for HLE. You know, understanding that as long as they put their more volatile player into a good position, they probably have enough talent to be able to just win the game off of talent alone, and that's exactly what happened. And for K-Corp on the other side, they just didn't have the ability to stand up and, like, go toe-to-toe with HLE. Kana was put into a really bad spot and did go toe-to-toe with Zeus. He's obviously a player that Kana's pretty familiar with, and I'm not blaming Kana at all. He's by far been the best player on K-Corp across this entire tournament. I think Kaliste had a pretty great game on the Ezreal, all things considered. I'm not even really blaming Yike for this one, or Targamas. I think mid lane just lost so hard that it ended up being pretty unwinnable for K-Corp in almost any other way. Vladi is the obvious choice for dead of the game. This was a really awful Talia game, and quite frankly, he's having an awful tournament. All of this coming off of the back of everybody kind of crowning him the #1 mid laner in Europe. I think a lot of that hype has died down. Spoiler alert for my primer video that I'm going to do on the LEC. I think I've already spoiled this a bit, but, you know, going into that split, I already probably was going to put him at #2 below Caps. He's definitely not #1 now. Like, after this international performance, there's just been a lot of parts of his game that I think have gotten exposed, and that I think will be capitalized on more when he does get back domestically. There's so much, like, exploitable tape now out there about Vladi, and maybe he just isn't good enough to be able to go up against the best mid laners in the world, and maybe he's good enough to beat all the LEC mid laners, and we kind of get into this Larson-esque cycle, but that's kind of the player that I'm comparing him to, is like prime Larson. It kind of feels very similar to that, where when he gets taken out of rhythm, it's just really impossible for him to have even a relevant game in any sort of way. Talia is so strong and should be in a really great spot alongside the Xin Zhao in the early game here, and he still ended up being pretty useless. So, not good stuff from Vladi. The rest of the team was fine. I'm not even really blaming K-Corp all that much. They played okay. HLE just was better, and I think that's the problem. That was kind of the expectation. K-Corp has gotten better basically every game at this tournament, but how much does that even really matter? Well, we're going to see in Game 2, K-Corp either picks this one up and keeps this series alive, or HLE could walk out of this with a 2-0 dominant win, just like they have all of the other series so far. Which will it be? Well, the winner of Game number 2 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game. And they looked awesome here in game number 2. I honestly did not expect this game to go the way that it ended up going. I think that there are a lot of reasons to, you know, say like, oh yeah, this could have been anticipated when you come out of draft, when you come out of the game situation that both of these teams generally ended up in. But for the most part, I didn't really see this K-Corp comp as being the one to scale better in this game, and it went 40 minutes. I certainly did not see HLE being a little bit outplayed in a lot of these fights, just not really having the damage to be able to break through the front line of K-Corp. Like, I don't think HLE completely through or anything like that, although I do think their draft has some pretty major flaws. But at the end of the day, like, K-Corp just kind of was better in a lot of the fights. They had the strongest carry in this game, and that's why they came out on top. It's a pretty easy game to end up talking about. I know a lot ended up happening, but they won the fights that matter. They got the Elder Dragons, and that, again, is really all that ends up, mattering in the end. It doesn't matter that HLE got all the grubs. It doesn't matter that HLE got Otacon. Like, you were able to keep your head about you. You were able to, I guess, calm the storm and be able to pick up the fights when it mattered the most, and that's why you're walking out of this game with a victory. So let's go ahead and talk about it. As for the drafts on both sides, I think I like HLE's a little more. I think both of these drafts are crazy similar. I think the problem for K-Corp is that you're building around like Azir, Ivern potentially in the late game, but you wouldn't necessarily think that Jhin and Ambessa are like great for that style. I love the Jhin this game as a specific answer to the Ashe. I just am not a fan of Azir B1. Again, I will continue to die on that hill. I'm even less of a fan of Corki R3. These are the two mid laners that I'm complaining about the most right now because both of them should be a lot more exploitable than they are. A lot of teams are still greeting and taking them not only early in drafts, but into each other, which just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I don't think you should be answering scaling with scaling when it comes to mid lane. I think you should try to punish it early, especially if you're HLE and you've got playmakers on your side. You've got Ashe Renata down in the bot lane, which is now kind of neutralized because Jhin can't really lose to that. You've got Peanut on Maokai. He's been very good on that in the mid game. Like, it just feels weird to draft the Corki on R3. I don't really understand it. I continue to be baffled that a lot of pro teams are opting into these matchups, but at the end of the day, like, HLE should still have the more consistent team fight. You definitely have the better engage when it comes to not only Maokai ultimate, but like, you've got Gnar ult, you've got Ashe arrow, you've got Renata ult, you've got so many different ways to affect this. You have a ton of damage. You've got the Corki to be a primary damage dealer in the back half here. Gnar and Ashe are both going to be problems, as we've seen. Like, Renata's generally great for team fights, and so you feel pretty good the later this game goes off of draft. If you're HLE, the problem is K-Corp just had the strongest carry, and that was Kaliste on this Jhin. I talked about how Jhin is a really great answer to Ashe. That's like 2016 esports talk there, where Jhin was always the answer to Ashe in that case, or whenever it was, like forever ago, a decade ago at this point. Crazy to say that, but Kaliste definitely made the Jhin worth it. All of us Jhin believers who have been kind of going to bat for this champ for a while can really kind of take a dance right about now, because so many people have been ragging on this champion and calling it not very good for so long. To see Jhin show up in such an important moment for K-Corp on one of the primary carries for them and legit just completely take over the game. 17 kills for Kaliste. It's awesome. Like, you're proud of Kaliste, obviously. He's gotten better game in and game out at this tournament so far, and even the games that they lost, like, he's only been bad a couple of times. I would say he's only felt like he's been outclassed a couple of times. He stepped up in a huge moment against maybe the best team in the world here and looked really good at his first international tournament. That's such an encouraging sign, and you're definitely excited about that. But I think this game is a lot harder without Yike on the Ivern. I know Yike's not going to maybe get as much credit for this champion as others will, but he pulled it out when it mattered on day number 3. He's doing it again here on day number 4. Ivern's definitely a European pick, an LEC pick. We've talked about players like Razork having a ton of success with this champion internationally and domestically in the past, and Yike is very much a part of that ilk, a part of that mold, and the Ivern Jhin was basically unstoppable in the back half of this game. He was melting, like legit one-shotting Maokai and Gnar on the front line of these fights. It was absurd how much damage Kaliste was doing. This is what happens when you are so far ahead of everybody else in the game, and that's why they ended up winning a lot of these Elder fights. I think you can give a lot of credit to Targamas as well. He was unreal in terms of the Alistar engages, and I honestly considered giving him player of the game for this one because I think he's going to go a bit undervalued for how good he was, because Yike and Kaliste were a little bit more out there in terms of noticeable value, but Targamas was elite in this game. Like, this is top-end support play coming in from him on the Alistar. I'm still a bit concerned about Vladi. Like, he's just not maximizing his damage, and again, I don't love the Azir pick. He definitely looks like the weak link internationally right now, but Kana has been totally fine on the top side. You're not worried about him, and if the bot lane and jungle are both going to step up for K-Corp, that is a dangerous proposition, and now they're one game away from, like, actively turning things around. They already pulled off the upset yesterday against Top Esports. If they go into game number 3 here and take down HLE, like, we could be talking about not only a team that has confirmed their spot after a bad start into the bracket stage, but a team that could actually make some noise and like make finals potentially in K-Corp, which is way more interesting than we expected after the first 2 days. But for HLE, this is kind of just a lot of greed. You kind of just got outplayed in the back half of this game. Zeka once again looked awesome, just completely outplaying Vladi for most of this game. There's really not a lot you can talk about positively for K-Corp in the mid lane right now. Zeka looks incredible on these picks, but the problem is they just didn't have the consistency, and honestly, they just didn't have the front line to be able to survive. Peanut was getting melted in the back half of these games, and he's going to get dead of the game for it. I don't even know how much I really blame him. Like, it's his job on Maokai to eat all of that Jhin damage. The problem is he just couldn't survive it, and I think that's why they ended up losing. Of course, obviously, their early and mid-game was pretty solid, and that's where I would have expected them to falter the most, and so maybe you just gotta point to saying, like, maybe slightly better execution lets you walk out of this game with a win, but it's a very weird game. I think it's a lot more on K-Corp doing well, on Kalist getting fed, and on the team being able to enable that, rather than on HLE for kind of throwing it away. I still think Viper had a pretty solid game. Again, Zeka was awesome in this game on the Corki. I still don't like Corki mid, but Zeka is really good, and so you can basically get away with anything on him. Zeus and Delight, I think, were fine. Even Peanut, who got done of the game, was generally fine. I don't think this is one of those games where, like, HLE had a horrible experience. I legit just think it was slightly better execution from K-Corp at the fights that mattered, and they're walking out with the win. And so now we move on to game 3. It's kind of do or die for K-Corp. Again, might be their last game at the tournament. Depending on what ends up happening, this could really determine whether or not they continue playing games or whether or not they're going to be the first team out. For HLE, you certainly don't want your first series loss to be the team that ended up falling to both Team Liquid and CFO, teams that you have absolutely crushed, or CFO you've crushed, and Team Liquid you're obviously better than. You don't want that to be the case. You want to be able to walk out of this main group stage undefeated, but a lot less on the line. Maybe that means K-Corp's going to show up. We will see right now, because the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series 2-1, and they will shut the door on a potential K-Corp comeback. It's definitely a disappointing result for KC, but you can't say they didn't come out swinging here with the draft in game number 3. They definitely tried with this draft. Draven on R2, the Rise on R5. There are a lot of pieces here that you can talk about where they definitely threw something at the wall. They definitely saw something in scrims that they liked. It just didn't end up working out for them. HLE with a pretty greedy draft here. I think that there absolutely is a way to win this game, because I think your team fight setup is actually ludicrously good. Like, the Rel plus Wukong engage is basically impossible for K-Corp to stop. There's almost no way that Draven is going to be able to take over the later part of this game, regardless of how fed he is, because I just don't know how he ever stays safe in any of these team fights, dodging J Shock Blasts and Rel and Wukong engages. Like, it's a really tough game for Draven to end up playing out, but you also took a lot of risks, because I don't think you're really looking at any good early game matchups here for them. Maybe the Jace into Rise. Obviously, I think that's Jace favored, and I think in lane, that's definitely something where Jace can win, but Rise has so much mobility to be able to create plays elsewhere. For the most part, you're looking at K-Corp saying, you should win almost every skirmish so long as Draven is even remotely in this game, and HLE should have a lot of trouble being able to maintain that same kind of pressure. Now, the longer this game goes, again, the better HLE's comp gets in the context of this game, but unfortunately for K-Corp, they could not get the Draven online. That's where all of the damage in this comp ends up coming from, and if the Draven is going to lose, oops, that's not good. You don't really have any way to win. HLE's greedy pick of Kai'Sa in the bot lane ends up working out for them, and, you know, we'll talk about that now. Viper is going to get player of the game in game number 3. I mean, Fancy Feet would be putting it lightly in terms of how he played this game. Like, beautiful positioning from Viper on the Kai'Sa. This was one of his better games of the entire year. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but he completely outplayed Kalist and Targamas and Yike to a lesser extent, and Vladi, really. Like, he kind of just was the best player on the Rift in this important game, and doing it on Kai'Sa, and specifically a Kai'Sa that you picked into Draven, is ridiculous. I hate this matchup for Kai'Sa. I think it's very difficult to deal with, because you're so short-ranged in lane. Like, Draven just gets a free laning phase to be able to punish you out, and there's really nothing you can do about that, and Viper said, who cares? It doesn't matter. I'm going to be able to dodge and outplay a lot of your situations anyways. I'm still going to be the most useful AD carry in the game, and we're going to be able to go off of that. Credit to Viper, but player of the series for me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. I didn't have to think about this. Zeka looked incredible, just was better than Vladi, really in all 3 games. Even in K-Corp's win, it just wasn't particularly close. Zeka is a monster. He's the best player on HLE at the current moment in terms of the, like, high-end talent. Maybe Delight, like, is able to compete with that. Viper and Zeus obviously have their moments, but, like, Zeka's ridiculous in terms of what he's able to do at his absolute best. The Jace is really important for stabilizing that mid game for HLE, for getting to the part of the game where the Wukong, Kai'Sa, Rel, like, combo can take over, and I thought he did really well in this game on that. He absolutely won every mid lane matchup. I gotta give a lot of credit to Zeus for once again picking Vladimir. You know, I complimented the Vladimir pick yesterday, kind of talking about how I thought it was better than people were going to give it credit for. They called it a for fun pick, but I really liked its laning matchup in particular in that game. I do not like Vladimir into Sion. Like, what is this? Like, if you're drafting Vladimir with the idea of putting it top lane, because honestly, to me, I think you flex these two. I think you put Zeka on Vladimir. I think you put Zeus Zeus on Jace in this game number 3, at least in terms of the matchups, but obviously they wanted Zeka on Jace, and Zeus is the Vladimir player, as we've seen, but I don't really get this at all. I feel like this is a bad matchup for Vladimir. He's not going to do anything to Sion. Like, he'll never have any lane pressure because Sion just completely neutralizes the minuscule damage that Vladimir already does. It's not that Sion can kill him or anything like that, but like, Vlad should not be able to get into any sort of relevant spot in this game, and yet here we are. Zeus was good in team fights. Peanut was awesome on the Wukong. Yike was really good on the Sejuani on the other side of this. He tried his absolute best to win this game for K-Corp. It just didn't really end up mattering. Viper was the best player in game 3. I think Zeka was the best player across this series, and HLE remains undefeated heading into the final day of groups at this tournament, at least in terms of series score after dropping game 2. But for K-Corp, this is a brutal loss because, again, I don't want to say that your entire tournament rested on this game, but this could be the last game you play at First Stand. It's actually a pretty big possibility, and we'll talk about that in the standings section, that this is the last game that you play at First Stand, that you're going to be eliminated because you lost this, and to put all of that on the line with like a Khalees Draven comp is crazy. It's like super bold, but it almost ended up working out. The problem is that Khalees did not get fed here. He's going to get dead of the game. How could I possibly give it to anybody else? Like, HLE clearly had a plan of shutting down the Draven. I'm not even really blaming Khalees. Like, he didn't do anything necessarily wrong. It's just, obviously, HLE had better setup for being able to take down the Draven than the Draven had for staying alive, and that meant that K-Corp really had no way to win this game. I think Vladi was pretty awful in this series, got pretty outclassed by Zeka in all 3 games. I was not impressed with him. You know, Kana and Targamas were good. Targamas was awesome in game 2. Kana was fine. Didn't have those game-breaking performances, but he was also on Sion here in game 3, so how much are you really putting on him? And then Yike was awesome in game number 3. Honestly, Yike was really good throughout the entirety of this series. You know, he was Yikes at the beginning of this tournament. The first 2 series were just awful from him, like some of the worst international performances we had ever seen from a major region player, but he really stepped it up when it mattered. Like, these were the best games he's played at this tournament, and this was a pretty good time for that to happen. But again, all of it's out of their control now. It's out of their hands. They do not control their own destiny anymore. They're done. They don't play another game in the group stage. They have to hope something happens on day number 5 that's not expected, and that's just a rough place to be, but it's the grave, unfortunately, they dug for themselves by not being good early on. It's nice to see the progression of this team, and I think they would be interesting to see in best of 5s, but we'll have to wait and see if that's going to be a reality. And then for HLE, I don't think this locks in the number 1 seed. I think it might lock in the number 1 seed. Like theoretically, I guess they could lose tomorrow and CFO could win, and you could see that, but like, for the most part, this is the number 1 seed. We're expecting this to be a team that goes undefeated at this tournament. It looked a little bit shaky there, but at the end of the day, they were better. They performed better, and even with some questionable draft decisions, they still were able to come out on top in this one, and that's kind of what you're expecting from the best team in the world. All right, but that is going to do it for my First Stand 2025 day number 4 overview and analysis video. Only 1 day remains in the group stage for these teams to stay alive, and unfortunately for the team right now at the bottom of the standings, it's out of their control. They're sitting at 1-3, and they are done for the tournament. Their day 5 is their day off, so they have no control over what ends up happening, but we're going to quickly run through what the outcomes are, what each outcome ends up meaning for who ends up making it, what way they end up making it in, what the potential first round or semifinal matchups could be in a single elimination best of 5 tournament between 4 teams. Like, there's still a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, HLE and Flying Oyster are locked. At 3-0 and 2-1 respectively, they are in guaranteed. Now, I think their seeding technically can fluctuate, or CFO's seeding can fluctuate. I don't think HLE can drop from number 1, because even if they lose and CFO wins, they have the tiebreaker, and so you would imagine that they're the number 1 seed. I believe that they are locked as the number 1 seed regardless of what happens tomorrow, and CFO is guaranteed a spot in top 4. Again, theoretically, they could fall lower depending on who ends up winning some of the other series that end up happening, but for at least right now, we are looking at, you know, HLE and CFO guaranteed in the top 4, and then the other 3 teams kind of fighting it out for those final spots. Now, let's walk through tomorrow's matchups quickly and talk about what each result means. First of all, the 2 matchups are Hanwha Life Esports taking on Team Liquid, and Top Esports taking on the Flying Oysters. These are interesting matchups because they determine everything. The most likely scenario is, of course, Hanwha Life beating Team Liquid and Top Esports beating CFO. If that happens, K-Corp is unfortunately the team on the outside looking in. Both them and Team Liquid would be the 2 teams at 1-3, and Team Liquid would have the head-to-head and would take the tiebreaker in that regard, because head-to-head is the top tiebreaker according to Riot in this tournament. And so TL, having beaten K-Corp, would be the team getting that number 4 seed, and like I said, K-Corp would be the team on the outside looking in. Now, how can K-Corp stay alive? Well, the most likely outcome that needs to happen for K-Corp to stay alive, because there are a couple, is that HLE beat Team Liquid and CFO upsets Top Esports. Top Esports' bad run of form that they've had recently continues, and they end up losing to the Flying Oysters. If that happens, and Team Liquid loses to Hanwha Life, Team Liquid would be on the outside looking in, because all three of Top Esports, Team Liquid, and K-Corp would be sitting at 1 and 3, and because of the way the tiebreaker works there, Team Liquid would be the team that ends up getting eliminated, having lost to Top Esports, and K-Corp having beaten Top Esports. So I know it's a complicated situation, but that's how Team Liquid could potentially, be eliminated. I would consider that the second most likely outcome. Again, to reiterate, that would mean that Hanwha Life beats Team Liquid tomorrow and CFO beats Top Esports. If that happens, TL is on the outside looking in. Now, technically, it is possible for Top Esports to miss this stage as well, but it is much more difficult for them to miss the bracket stage than it is for the other teams, because both upsets would have to happen in order for Top Esports to miss the actual stage. Team Liquid would need to be able to survive by beating Hanwha Life Esports and getting that second series win, and Top Esports would still have to lose to CFO. In that situation, it's a 1 in 3 tiebreaker between Top Esports and K-Corp, which K-Corp wins because of the head-to-head. That is the only way Top Esports can miss the bracket stages, if TL beats HLE and Top Esports loses to the Flying Oysters. But again, as long as they beat CFO, none of that matters. They are safe no matter what. Now, if Team Liquid beats HLE, they are safe no matter what. Just, I guess, as a final go-through of the last outcome, if TL upsets HLE but Top Esports still gets the job done against CFO, then K-Corp would still be on the outside looking in, because both TES and Team Liquid would be at 2 and 2 instead of 1 and 3. So again, I know it's a lot, but the most likely outcome right now is K-Corp missing it if the results go as expected. What K-Corp is hoping for is a Hanwha Life win and a Flying Oysters win. If that happens tomorrow, then K-Corp can survive, but again, it's entirely out of your hands. So European fans, you are the biggest fan in the world of the Flying Oysters tomorrow. North American fans, you're the biggest fan in the world of Top Esports tomorrow, because if TES wins, you're guaranteed to get in regardless of what else happens. So again, a lot on the line for these teams, but I'm so excited for the final day, day number 5. We're going to be covering it here on the channel. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We will be covering day 5 as well as, day 6 and 7, the semifinals and finals of this tournament, when we finally do get into the best of 5 stage and really start talking about Fearless Draft. We'll be covering all of those days on this channel, so hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all